as modern people because of the invention of antibiotics, which we are currently in the process of destroying as rapidly as we possibly can, right? Because they're given wide scale to animals and to people to far too great a degree, and all over the world we're generating new infectious diseases that are resistant to antibiotics, all known antibiotics, and we don't have any new antibiotics in the pipeline. So although we've had a 60, 70-year hiatus where infectious diseases were well controlled, they're back on the march again. And for example, there are multiple strains that have emerged of antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis that can't be treated by any known combination of antibiotics. And those are actually this is a terrible thing, they tend to be bred in hospitals. And my guess is, if we did the epidemiology properly, that hospitals kill more people than they save. And the reason they do that is because they bring people together who have diseases and they breed infectious disease of all sorts that's antibiotic resistant. It's absolutely insane. And here's another thing we do that's completely crazy. So, if you bring cattle to a feedlot, they're fed, this is particularly the case in the US, but it's also the case in Ontario. They're fattened up on corn. And the reason they're fattened up on corn is because corn is heavily subsidized as a crop, so it's damn near free. That's why there's corn syrup in everything, right? Because it's a very low cost source of calories. And you might say, well, hooray, you know, a low cost source of calories. Isn't that wonderful? Because that means that people who don't have any money get to eat. And right, fair enough. But the subsidy has made corn so cheap that you can feed it to cows to fatten them up because they get quite fat fast. They gain a lot of weight fast with corn. The problem is cows can't digest corn. So it makes them sick, or they digest it very badly. It makes them sick. They're not designed for it. They're designed to eat grass, not corn. And so in order to stop the cows from dying when you feed them corn, you pump them full of antibiotics. And that's one of the things that's breeding antibiotic resistance. So it's not very smart, but that's what we're doing. And no one really notices, and that's a very bad idea. So you can be sure, one of the things that you can be virtually certain of is that whatever you're worried about happening terribly in the future, it will be something else that you're not worrying about that will actually cause the problem. And this could certainly be one of those things. Local parasite types and host defense systems will typically be involved in a co-evolutionary arms race. And so at any given time, a host's immunological defenses will be specialized to be most effective against local parasite species. To the extent that a host defense system is specialized locally, contact with outgroups will be associated with an increased risk of exposure to infectious diseases against which there is no a priori immunity. Okay, I'm going to read that again because you should think about it. To the extent that a host defense system is specialized locally, contact with outgroups will be associated with an increased risk of exposure to infectious diseases against which there is no a priori immunity. Black Plague, Europe, came in on ships, right? The Europeans started to spread out. They came back with the ships. The rats came off the ships. Poof, a third of the European population died. The relevant infection-avoiding behaviors, such as avoidance of strangers and high conscientiousness in, for example, food preparation, are assumed to arise from the operation of a behavioral immune system. The behavioral immune system comprises adaptive psychological response mechanisms that are sensitive to cues that might predict the presence of infectious pathogens and which respond with appropriate cognitive processing and affective reactions. Such a system, this is the next thing that you want to pay attention to. Such a system is likely to be oversensitive. The cost of a false positive, avoiding non-existent infection, is small relative to the possible cost, catching an avoidable infection. Okay, so you're walking through the grass and your snake detectors go off. The paraphobia of your eyes, the periphery, is specialized for the detection of things that might threaten you. And so you could say, well, you have snake detection systems in the periphery of your vision that are hypersensitive, because if you see a stick and you think snake and you jump up in the air, the cost is you jumped up in the air. So who cares that you misidentified the snake? But if there's a snake there and you don't see it and it bites you, then you're dead. So the logic is, why not set the systems that protect you to be hypersensitive, because the cost of the hypersensitivity is low compared to the cost of hyposensitivity, right? In social terms, an important component of the parasite stress hypothesis is that high levels of infection may lead to ethnocentrism, xenophobia, distrust of different others, and conformity, because such behaviors will reduce the likelihood of exposure to unfamiliar infections to which immunity has not been developed. Why is there strict sexual morality? Because promiscuity is a prime vector for disease transmission. That's one of the reasons. Conservatism as the social immune system. Disgust is considered to be one of the basic human emotions, defined by a strong revulsion and desire to withdraw from an eliciting stimulus or event. Physically, disgust is accompanied by a distinct facial expression involving constriction of the oral and nasal cavities. So that's the disgust phase, which closes up your nose and your mouth so that things can't get in. Evolutionary models of disgust propose that this emotion evolved to help us avoid contaminated or harmful foods or other potential sources of disease, such as sexual contact. You know, there's lots of psychoanalytic theories about sexual shame and sexual disgust, but it's much more straightforward, as far as I'm concerned, to view it as a biological battle. There's approach systems and sexual arousal systems that are involved in moving you forward towards a sexual partner, but there's disgust systems that guard you against it, and those two things are mutually regulatory, and so you're basically stuck in the middle. It's half move forward and half be repelled, and that's partly also the balance of those two things is what helps you select a sexual partner, and people generally are quite selective about their sexual partners. So, and we say, well, why are you selective about your sexual partners? Well, there's the obvious practical reasons, but then there's the reasons that are more tightly associated with biological protection. And so, even though we don't like to think that way. In addition to its role in directly helping to expel harmful foods from the body, disgust also forms an important component of the behavioral immune system, the suite of psychological mechanisms that aid in the detection and avoidance of potential contaminants before they can make contact with the body. Although disgust may have its origins in the protection against physical contamination, a number of studies have implicated disgust responses in moral decision-making. And there's been experiments that are specifically associated with the elicitation of disgust and the observation of the corresponding behaviors in the lab. So here's an example. So imagine I gave you a sterilized beaker, and I said, well, expel some saliva into it. Now wait 10 seconds and drink it. Will you? Well, people, no. You see, you made a disgust face, right? Well, the question is, why? Right? You know it's sterile. It was in your mouth seconds before. Why all of a sudden have you switched from it being part of your body to not being part of your body? And also being part of your body that, well, wasn't ingested, it was part of you, to being something that there's no damn way you're going to have anything to do with. So, well, so that's a good example. That's a good example of the disgust mechanism in operation. You know, distinguishing between self and non-self is a very, very difficult thing, and there's multiple mechanisms that do it, and it's definitely necessary. Although disgust may have its origins in protection against physical contamination, a number of studies have implicated disgust responses in moral decision making. I mean, you know that you can see the activity of the behavioral immune system in such simple things as avoiding sources of contamination on a sidewalk, right? If you see something that's disgusting, say rotting food or something like that on a sidewalk, the probability that you're going to step in it is very low. You're going to see it, and you're going to make a face, and you're going to go around it. And the reason for that is because you don't want that attached to you in any way. And the reason for that is, well, it's disgusting, it's contaminating, and the association there is that it's a place where you could conceivably pick up a disease. Now you see pathologies of this system arise. Generally, obsessive compulsive disorder, so chronic hand washing, for example, is classified as an anxiety disorder, but there is an anxiety component to it, but I don't believe that that's an accurate classification. I think that obsessive compulsive disorder is actually a disorder of disgust, because all of the behaviors, including hyper grooming, because people sometimes have trichotillomania, they'll pull out the hairs on their body. The grooming behaviors and that sort of thing seem to be more associated with the operation of the disgust system, and almost everything about obsessive compulsive disorder has a disgust basis. And so one of the things that people who have OCD obsess about is that Like I had a client once who was, this poor woman, by the time her OCD was done with her, she'd built the equivalent of an airlock on her house, like not technically proficient or anything like that, and her husband and her children had to go through an elaborate decontamination process before they were allowed to step foot in the house. And one of the things she was very concerned about was that she would go out to a supermarket and touch a piece of fruit and become contaminated, and then come home and touch her children, and then they would become contaminated. And so, well, she ended up in the hospital, and she was divorced. And I mean, it just did in her life, you know. And so, and people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, you know, they'll wash their hands until the soap is gone, like a whole bar of soap, right? And you can often tell who they are because their hands are shiny from washing too much. And they'll shower, they can't get out of the shower, they'll shower until the hot water is completely gone. And you know, so their self-cleaning mechanisms, so to speak, have gone seriously astray. And the way you treat them is by exposing them to things that are disgusting and contaminating. I had a client with OCD once. He was quite the character, and one of the things I had him do was we would look for things on the internet, pictures of things that really disgusted him. It's not that much fun, by the way, treating someone who has OCD, because I'm rather disgust sensitive, and so that was also rather hard on me. So anyways, we would look for things on the internet that he really didn't like, and then I'd print them out and have him put them on his fridge, which he did not like at all. And he had a bunch of other problems, and we got along quite well, but for a long time, I treated him for about 3 years. He would phone me like 3 or 4 times a day because he had obsessive compulsive disorder, and just swear at me like mad, you know. He'd just swear. I'd get these messages. He'd phone me, and he's just so mad at me because I'd have him put these things on his fridge, you know. And so he'd curse and swear and yell at me, and then 2 minutes later he would phone and apologize and say he was really sorry and hoped I would continue to see him. And God, that just went on forever. But I felt sorry for the poor guy, you know. He eventually ended up getting a puppy. Yeah, see, you agreeable people. Oh, a puppy! God, unbelievable, eh? Yeah. Anyways, that was good for him because he had to go around and clean up after the puppy, eh? But that poor puppy, it was quite dominant, and the things that happened to that poor guy. So the puppy would dominate him, so he'd take it outside to take it for a walk, and he wasn't a very skilled person in many, many ways. He had a very large number of severe impediments, and so, but he really liked this puppy. He didn't have any friends or anything like that, and he was supported by his aged mother, and it was just a catastrophe. And he'd go outside and try to walk the puppy, and the puppy would just sit down, right? Because it was doing dominant stuff, and he didn't know how to overcome it. And then these crazy people from across the way who styled themselves as animal rights activists started to harass him, eh? And they phoned up his mother and told him that if she didn't take the dog away from that retard, they were going to come over and, you know, do terrible things to him. And then he got harassed on the street, and then he went to a park with his dog, and they came up to him and pushed him on the car and swiped his dog and ran off to the SPCA and dumped it there, and he had to move away from his apartment. And God, it was just an absolute catastrophe. They had plenty of sympathy for that damn dog, but no sympathy whatsoever for the guy, you know. It was really something. Anyways, the story ended happily, weirdly enough. He got a job with a woman who used to be a psychiatric nurse who was training dogs, and she gave him a little job setting up the dog training thing, and then he got to learn to train his dog. He was a thin guy to begin with. He lost like 30 pounds trying to learn how to take care of this puppy. It was just, I thought he was going to die, but there was no way he was going to give up that dog. And so, anyways, OCD, it's quite the bloody catastrophe. So, and it's a good thing for someone who has OCD to have a dog, right? Because dogs are messy. And so there's all sorts of things that are messy about them, but you have to kind of live with the mess, like you have to live with the mess if you're going to have a child or if you're going to have a partner of any sort. You know, you can't let the orderliness part of you get the upper hand so terribly that it's impossible for you to live. That's what happens to girls who have anorexia, by the way. You know how there's this idea with regards to anorexia that it's often high-achieving girls who have it. Well, it's hyper-conscientious girls. They get so disgust sensitive they can't stand their own bodies. And so, for example, then they stop being able to look at their bodies properly. And so what they do, instead of looking at their whole body, they lose the ability to do that. They only can see parts of their body, and then they can't tell the difference between a part that's healthy and well-shaped and a fat part. And so anything that's what would you call, of dubious anything that's hard to measure becomes impossible to see. So I had an anorexic client at one point. She wasn't a very big woman, maybe about this big and thin, yes, obviously. And so I was trying to work with her on her body perception disorder, and one of the things I did was, so I had her come and sit beside me. So I was sitting like this, and so was she, and I said, well, you look at our two thighs, which one is bigger? And like mine was like 40% bigger. And she said, well, I can't tell, they look the same to me. And so I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. I let her do it. I said, you take a pencil, and I'll sit on a piece of paper, and you just trace my thigh, okay? And then you can put that piece of paper underneath your thigh and trace it, and then you can look at the difference. Well, so I had her do that, and she looked at the two pieces of paper, and she couldn't believe it. She could not believe that that was actually the case, because her perception had become so disordered that it was impossible for her to see the real shape of her body. And we would go outside, and I would ask her, you know, is that person thin? Is that person fat? And with other people she could tell, but with her own body, not a chance. She couldn't see it properly at all. And so there's a real obsession with purity among women who have anorexia. You know, they'd like to starve themselves right down to the bone, because the bone is sort of pure and white and there's no excess tissue on it. And so anorexia also looks like a disease of disgust. And so it's very, very difficult to, she thought in very black and white terms. One of the things I had her do at one point was, said, she has a music, she said, I either really like a song or I don't like it at all. And I said, okay, well, you've got a music collection. Why don't you go through like 20 of those songs and rate them on a scale from 1 to 10? And she couldn't do it. It was either yes or no, orderly, right? The boundaries around the categories were absolutely segregated. And her apartment tended to be decorated in black and white. And she was hyper clean, you know, so everything in the apartment was extraordinarily orderly, well put away. She couldn't stand to see anything disgusting on the counters and that sort of thing. So very, very difficult disorder to treat, anorexia. Very, very difficult. So, and you know, you can see how it can go wrong, because food, you know, when you're eating, your disgust systems are on alert, you know, like you want the thing you want to eat, and you absolutely don't want the thing you don't want to eat. And your mouth is very sensitive to that sort of thing, you know, to the texture and all of that. And your sense of smell is very sensitive to that sort of thing, because, you know, you don't want to eat anything that's contaminated or poisonous. So it's another situation like sex, where the reward system is driving you forward to engage in a consumatory behavior, but the disgust system is right there modulating and moderating it, and there's a tension between those two things that's already always at work. And with the anorexic types, the disgust system gets the upper hand. So she was also extraordinarily judgmental and perfectionistic, but that goes along with it, because orderly people are judgmental and perfectionistic. And so if you're a perfectionist, often what that means is you have very high levels of orderliness and very high levels of neuroticism. And those two things chase each other around like mad, because you can't stand the idea that you would make a mistake, and you get anxious about it as well. So then you get stuck in this perfectionistic mindset and you can't get out of it. So inducing disgust responses, whether via a foul order, a disgusting work environment, or recalling a disgusting experience, led individuals to assign harsher punishments to others who had committed moral transgressions. So you describe a moral transgression, maybe breaking a law, you expose the people in the experiment to some disgusting stimulus, and then you ask them about the probability that the person was guilty, and then also how long they should be imprisoned or how much they should be fined. And if you get the people disgusted, then the probability, especially if they're orderly, then the probability of assigning a harsh punishment goes upward. So if you're ever in court, don't disgust the judge, right? That's part of the deal. Harsher moral judgments can even be induced following the consumption of a bitter drink, because bitter substances are often poison, or poisonous substances are often bitter, and that induces a disgust response as well. Although you can overcome that. Coffee is bitter, olives are bitter, so you can retrain your system to accept those things as food, but it's not particularly easy. In addition, the same disgust-related facial expressions are observed in response to unpleasant tastes, disgusting photographs, and receiving unfair treatment in an economic game. Concerns about cleanliness, and interesting, so some of you may know I was at McMaster University a couple of weeks ago, and there were a bunch of protesters there, and I went up to meet the protesters because I kind of wanted to see what would happen. There were a bunch of them around the back of the room, and I offered to shake their hands, and mostly what I got was disgust faces, you know, and that's not good. That's not good. So here's something to know too. Here's a good predictor of whether or not you're going to get divorced. You go into the therapist's office and you talk, the two of you talk, and you roll your eyes. That'll predict. If you're rolling your eyes at your partner, you're going to divorce them. Why? It's a disgust response, right? It's something like, I'm lifting you up with my eyes and throwing you into the garbage. It's something like that. But eye rolling is a great predictor of the probability of divorce. So it's something to keep in mind with regards to your relationships. Like if you're starting to develop some contempt or some disgust, you bloody well better get on that right away, because that's a bad road to go down. And so then you have to do whatever you have to do not to go down that road. Yeah, so, see, one of the things I think that's happening on the political landscape, and like we know, for example, that the more authoritarian politically correct types are high in agreeableness and high in orderliness, so that's a very interesting combination. And I think what's happening is that they're very rapidly dividing the world into contemptible predator. Like snakes often elicit a disgust response, right? A predator will elicit a disgust response, like a crocodile or an alligator or a snake or something like that. And so it's the predator response that's being evoked to the people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, roughly speaking. And so they're categorized as like contemptible predators, something like that. And the people that are being protected are like innocent victims. That's how it appears. And that's a very, very dangerous thing to have happen, as I'll show you. Concerns about cleanliness and feelings of disgust have likewise been related to political attitudes. Situational reminders of the importance of physical cleanliness, such as asking participants to wipe their hands with antiseptic wipes, tend to increase self-reported political conservatism. Such as finding is consistent with the notion that purity tends to be valued more highly by conservatives than by liberals. Individuals who report being disgusted more easily also tend to hold more conservative political views on topics including abortion, gay marriage, tax cuts, and affirmative action. In addition to the effects that have emerged when using self-reported disgust sensitivity, more conservative political views have also been associated with stronger physiological reactivity to disgusting images. There's a lawyer, Martha Nussbaum, who's also a political philosopher, who says that we should eliminate the effect of disgust on our political theorizing, that disgust shouldn't be something that's considered as a valid means of information from which you might derive political conclusions. So if I find your behavior disgusting, or if you find my behavior disgusting, according to Nussbaum, that should be independent. You should try to make that rationally independent of your political views. I'd like to believe that, but there's a problem, and this is the problem that we're going to go through. You can't muck about with these underlying systems. You can't just say, ignore the reports of your disgust system, because it isn't like your emotions are insane and irrational and you have the rationality on top of that that's guiding you properly. That isn't how it works. All of these underlying biological systems guide you, and to the degree that the degree to which you're guided properly is a consequence of the balance of the action of these underlying biological systems, but the balance is very complexly maintained. You need a disgust system, because if you didn't, you'd eat something that would kill you and then you would die. Or you'd do something stupid and you'd end up like you'd get cut and it would be dirty and you wouldn't clean it and then you would die. So the idea that you can somehow just rationalize the output of the disgust system and decontaminate your political viewpoints as a consequence seems to me to be very, very naive. Not that there's no danger to it, because there's plenty of danger to it. In addition, a large literature has converged on the notion that there are two core dimensions of conservative political ideology: resistance to change and tolerance of inequality. Resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society.